So this is on how to do apologetics jovially and subversively, G.K. Chesterton's model for today's evangelicals. When you look at this, the context of evangelical apologetics, you can see that there is a variety of ways to do apologetics, but sometimes our apologetics falls short of being successful and effective because it often does not connect well with people. And some of the shortcomings of Christian apologetics I will list quickly. One is that it's too abstract. So you might be already frightened by this illustration here, but this is only an illustration. Here you can see logical deduction of the ontological argument. And I'm sure this is a very good argument. I myself don't really understand it. So, but it probably resonates with some people, but it does not resonate with the majority of people. Sometimes our apologetic approach is too abstract. Sometimes it is too obvious. People already know what we would say. They already expect us. They expect us at the front door, and when we arrive, they just shoot us down, and it's the end. It's too obvious. Sometimes our apologetics is too cerebral. Here you can see a brilliant argument. It's the cosmological argument for the existence of God, and this is often used. I think it's good that this argument is used, but for many people it's too cerebral. Sometimes our apologetic approach is too sober. We are warning people. Sometimes we are just dry, ironic, bitter. Sometimes people see that we want to ban things that we find scandalous or offensive to our faith. And this is not winsome. It's not winning people because it puts them off. So in this talk, I would like to place Chesterton as an example in front of you, because I think there is a lot to learn from G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was an English writer, journalist, columnist. He was a philosopher, a lay theologian, and a literary and art critic. Once I had a very interesting conversation with a journalist who had worked for a left-wing Hungarian newspaper, an online news site that is very well known and well read in Hungary. And I asked him why he was interested in Christianity. And his answer was, I am interested in Christianity because Chesterton was the best columnist ever. And he was a Christian. So I am interested in Christianity because of Chesterton. When I was a young Christian, I came across some works by Chesterton. One was what you also see on the screen, a little book on Saint Francis of Assisi. It's a very, very interesting way of describing what happened to this man in the early Middle Age, in the Middle Ages. And it had a big impact on me. Another book that you see on the screen is a Hungarian translation of Heretics, which is a collection of essays that Chesterton wrote addressing his contemporaries and picking on them and some of the themes that they emphasized. And also, as a young Christian, I loved the Father Brown stories. I read the Father Brown stories, and I didn't know anything about Chesterton, but I knew that they were very well written and very interesting and engaging stories. But more importantly, Chesterton had a very significant impact on C.S. Lewis. In his autobiographical work, Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis keeps referring to G.K. Chesterton. When you read the book, you come across Chesterton's name all the time. So here are a few quotes that are relevant for this talk. This is what C.S. Lewis writes about Chesterton. Then I read Chesterton's Everlasting Man, and for the first time saw the whole Christian outline of history set out in a form that seemed to me to make sense. I already thought Chesterton the most sensible man alive apart from his Christianity. Now, I veritably believe, I thought, that Christianity itself was very sensible apart from its Christianity. In reading Chesterton, Lewis writes, I did not know what I was letting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. And Lewis wasn't too careful, so Chesterton had an entry to his soul. Chesterton had more sense than all the other moderns put together, baiting, of course, his Christianity. At another place in Surprised by Joy, Lewis writes, it was here that I first read a volume of Chesterton's essays. I had never heard of him and had no idea of what he stood for, nor can I quite understand why he made such an immediate conquest of me. It might have been expected that my pessimism, my atheism, and my hatred of sentiment would have made him to me the least congenial of all authors. It would almost seem that Providence, or some second cause of a very obscure kind, quite overrules our previous tastes when it decides to bring two minds together. Liking an author may be as involuntary and improbable as falling in love. I was by now a sufficiently experienced reader to distinguish liking from agreement. I did not need to accept what Chesterton said in order to enjoy it. Now, this is a very important point that Lewis makes. He says, I disagreed with Chesterton. I disagreed with his Christianity, but I didn't need to agree with him in order to enjoy him. And I think this is the key to Chesterton's apologetics, that people like Lewis enjoyed what he said or enjoyed the way he said things before they agreed with him. So what did Lewis enjoy in Chesterton? This is what he says. His humor was of the kind which I like best. Not jokes embedded in the page like currants in a cake. Still less, what I cannot endure, a general tone of flippancy and jocularity, but the humor which is not in any way separable from the argument, but is rather, as Aristotle would say, the bloom on dialectic itself. The sword glitters not because the swordsman set out to make it glitter, but because he's fighting for his life and therefore moving it very quickly. For the critics who think Chesterton frivolous or paradoxical, I have to work hard to feel even pity. Sympathy is out of the question. Moreover, strange as it may seem, I liked him for his goodness. So I think often our apologetics puts people off, not because of what we say, but because they don't see our goodness. They see a bitter, dry opposition and not a winsome way of arguing. But Lewis liked Chesterton. He liked him for his goodness. He was just good for him. Okay, so getting to Chesterton. Chesterton, if you want to imagine him, was a huge man. He was almost 2 meters high, 2 meters tall, and 130 kilograms. You can see on the picture that he was really a giant man. During the First World War, a lady in London asked why he was not out at the front. Chesterton replied, "If you go round to the side, you will see that I am." So he was a very funny person. He and G.B. Shaw, George Bernard Shaw, were good friends. And Chesterton remarked to George Bernard Shaw one time, "To look at you, anyone would think a famine had struck England." And Shaw retorted, "To look at you, anyone would think you had caused it." So I hope you have a sense of what kind of person he was and what his friendships were like. Waterhouse once described a very loud crash as a sound like G.K. Chesterton falling onto a sheet of tin. So he was this kind of person. And when I think of his apologetic method, these two words came to mind: jovial, subversiveness. I think that's what best characterizes what he did. Chesterton's apologetic method was subversive. A subversive person is a sneaky kind of revolutionary who tries to turn the system from underneath. And this is exactly what Chesterton tried to do. He undermined established mainstream opinions. And his main tool for doing that was paradox. He used paradoxes, and with the help of paradoxes, he undermined false beliefs. When you read Chesterton, he's not obvious. So he never comes in through the front door. They would expect him to come at the front door, but he sneaks in at the back door. And his paradoxes catches you off guard. You are not expecting them to come, and yet they come and take you off guard. But when you hear them, you have a deep sense of reality. The other word that I think characterizes his way of apologetics is the word jovial. Jovial means cheerful, friendly, and when you read him, you see that he's a playful man. He plays with words, he plays with sentences, and he's cheerful. He's full of life. He's friendly, and he's extremely witty, and cheeky, but never bitter. And he's always hopeful. So he's a very likable man. You want to be close to him, and even though you know that he would play with you and take you in and conquer you with his words. I will not read this whole quote, but in Heretics, he compares paganism to Christianity. And he says that paganism had those famous 4 virtues: justice, temperance, reason, or being rational. So there were the 4 virtues, the pagan virtues, and Christianity added 3 virtues to those, which are faith, hope, and charity. And in Chesterton's opinion, the main difference is that pagan virtues, such as justice and temperance, are sad virtues. But the Christian virtues, faith, hope, and charity, are the gay and exuberant virtues. So he celebrated Christianity over paganism because of the joy that Christianity brought. And also he said that each one of these Christian virtues involve a paradox of its own nature. So he thought that the sign of being a Christian was that it brought a paradoxical joy into the virtuous life. And when I think of Chesterton's method, the picture, the image that I have is what he writes about Saint Francis of Assisi in his biographical work of the medieval man, and particularly this one. Francis was converted and his life was changed, and this is what Chesterton says about his experience. When Francis came forth from his cave of vision, he would be the court fool of the King of Paradise. This state can only be represented in symbol, but the symbol of inversion is true in another way. If a man saw the world upside down, with all the trees and towers hanging head downwards, as in a pool, one effect would be to emphasize the idea of dependence. There is a Latin and literal connection, for the very word dependence only means hanging. It would make vivid the scriptural text which says that God has hanged the world upon nothing. If Saint Francis had seen in one of his strange dreams the town of Assisi upside down, it need not have differed in a single detail from itself, except in being entirely the other way around. But the point is this, that whereas to the normal eyes, the large masonry of its walls or the massive foundations of its watchtowers and its high citadel would make it seem safer and more permanent, the moment it was turned over to the very same weight would make it seem more helpless and more in peril. It is but a symbol, but it happens to fit the psychological fact. Saint Francis might love his little town as much as before, or more than before, but the nature of the love would be altered even in being increased. He might see and love every tile on the steep roofs or every bird on the battlements, but he would see them all in a new and divine light of eternal danger and dependence. Instead of being merely proud of his strong city because it could not be moved, he would be thankful to God Almighty that it had not been dropped. He would be thankful to God for not dropping the whole cosmos like a vast crystal to be shattered into falling stars. Perhaps St. Peter saw the world so when he was crucified head downwards. Now, Chesterton does the same. He turns a thought upside down so it would stand right side up. That's his method. Let me give you examples of how he does apologetics. You probably also noticed that pastors and priests are habitually presented in movies as hypocrites, dumb, stupid, weird, clumsy, incompetent, bumbling fools. So, shall we write petitions to ban films which misrepresent pastors and priests? Or shall we imitate Chesterton? What did Chesterton do? Well, first, in The Everlasting Man, this is the book that Lewis read and had an impact on him. Chesterton addresses this question because it was already happening 100 years ago when he wrote this book. This is what Chesterton says. The point of this book, in other words, is that the next best thing to being really inside Christendom is to be really outside it. And a particular point of it is that the popular critics of Christianity are not really outside it. Think of Richard Dawkins or some people who are similar to him. They're not really outside it. They are on a debatable ground in every sense of the term. They are doubtful in their very doubts. Their criticism has taken on a curious tone, as of a random and illiterate heckling. Thus, they make current and anti-clerical cant as a sort of small talk. They will complain of parsons dressing like parsons, as if we should be any more free if all the police who shadowed or collared us were plainclothes detectives. Or they will complain that a sermon cannot be interrupted and call a pulpit a coward's castle, though they do not call an editor's office a coward's castle. It would be unjust both to journalists and priests, but it would be much truer of journalists. The clergyman appears in person and could easily be kicked as he came out of church. The journalist conceals even his name so that nobody can kick him. They write wild and pointless articles and letters in the press about why churches are empty, without even going there to find out if they are empty or which of them are empty. So who is the real fool? I think this is a very, very good way to tackling this issue. But he did even more than that. He invented the character of Father Brown. Now, Father Brown is a priest, and he is the Sherlock Holmes of his detective stories. He's the detective who applies observation, logic, and intuition. And Father Brown's reasoning is more sound, more rounded, more sensible than the reasoning of others. So Chesterton engages the imagination and sneaks into it a reversed prejudice. So you will never forget that here's a parson, a priest, a pastor, who is more logical, more intuitive, more observing than others in those stories. So I think this is a very powerful way of doing apologetics. Let me give you another example. One of my favorite novels is The Man Who Was Thursday, A Nightmare. This is one of Chesterton's novels. And it begins with a conversation between Gregory, two artists. One is called Gregory, the other is called Mr. Syme. And it starts with Gregory. Gregory resumed in high oratorical good humor. An artist is identical with an anarchist, he cried. You might transpose the words anywhere. An anarchist is an artist. The man who throws a bomb is an artist because he prefers a great moment to everything. He sees how much more valuable is one burst of blazing light, one peal of perfect thunder, than the mere common bodies of a few shapeless policemen. An artist disregards all governments, abolishes all conventions. The poet, now remember this word, abolishes all conventions. The poet delights in disorder only. If it were not so, the most poetical thing in the world would be the Underground Railway. So it is, said Mr. Syme. Nonsense, said Gregory, who was very rational when anyone else attempted paradox. Why do all the clerks and navvies in the railway trains look so sad and tired, so very sad and tired? I will tell you, it is because they know that the train is going right. It is because they know that whatever place they have taken a ticket for, that place they will reach. It is because after they have passed Sloane Square, they know that the next station must be Victoria, and nothing but Victoria. Oh, their wild rapture. Oh, their eyes like stars and their souls again in Eden, if the next station were unaccountably Baker Street. It is you who are unpoetical, replied the poet Syme. If what you say of clerks is true, they can only be as prosaic as your poetry. The rare, strange thing is to hit the mark. The gross, obvious thing is to miss it. We feel it is epical when men with one wild arrow strikes a distant bird? Is it not also epical when man with one wild engine strikes a distant station? Chaos is dull, because in chaos, the train might indeed go anywhere, to Baker Street or to Baghdad. But man is a magician, and his whole magic is in this, that he does say, Victoria, and lo, it is Victoria. No, take your books of mere poetry and prose. Let me read a timetable with tears of pride. Take your Byron, who commemorates the defeats of man. Give me Bradshaw, who commemorates his victories. Give me Bradshaw, I say. Must you go? Inquired Gregory sarcastically. I tell you, went on Syme with passion, that every time a train comes in, I feel that it has broken past batteries of besiegers and that man has won a battle against chaos. You say contemptuously that when one has left Sloane Square, one must come to Victoria. I say that one might do 1,000 things instead, and that whenever I really come there, I have the sense of hairbreadth escape. And when I hear the guard shout out the word Victoria, it is not an unmeaning word. It is to me the cry of a herald announcing conquest. It is to me indeed Victoria. It is the victory of Adam. Gregory whacked his heavy red head with a slow and set smile. And even then, he said, we poets always ask the question, and what is Victoria now that you have got there? You think Victoria is like the New Jerusalem. We know that the New Jerusalem will only be like Victoria. Yes, the poet will be discontented even in the streets of heaven. The poet is always in revolt. There again, said Syme irritably, what is there poetical about being in revolt? You might as well say that it is poetical to be seasick. Being sick is a revolt. Both being sick and being rebellious may be the wholesome thing on certain desperate occasions, but I'm hanged if I can see why they are poetical. Revolt in the abstract is revolting. It's mere vomiting. It is things going right, he cried. That is poetical. Our digestions, for instance, going sacredly and silently right, that is the foundation of all poetry. Yes, the most poetical thing, more poetical than the flowers, more poetical than the stars, the most poetical thing in the world is not being sick. Really, said Gregory superciliously, the examples you choose. I beg your pardon, said Syme grimly. I forgot we had abolished all conventions. For the first time, a red patch appeared on Gregory's forehead. Now, this is an example of what Chesterton does. If you read the whole book, this is just the beginning. It's full of surprising. I won't spoil it for them. But when you find out who Sunday is in the book, and then you realize that something very deep and very happy is going on there, which is much, much more than the appreciation of order. This book is not just about the appreciation of order. And there's one more twist because it's called A Nightmare, but I won't spoil it. So what I want to say is that when you read this novel, you sense that you were taken in by joyful truth, and your world had been subverted by divine reality. And this is a very powerful way of doing apologetics. Okay, and another example. He deals with the question of progressivism and conservatism in both Heretics and Orthodoxy. These are two books. Heretics is the first one, and Orthodoxy is a later complementary work to Heretics. This is what he writes 100 years ago. The whole modern world has divided itself into conservatives and progressives. The business of progressives is to go on making mistakes. The business of conservatives is to prevent mistakes from being corrected. Even when the revolutionists might himself repent of his revolution, the traditionalist is already defending it as part of his tradition. So you see that although Chesterton sees that this is the main issue, conservatism or progressivism, that's the main discussion. And he was prophetic, because I think in the 21st century, this is still the main discussion. But Chesterton comes in from a different, a third perspective, which is the Christian perspective. He says, we have remarked that one reason offered for being a progressive is that things naturally tend to grow better. Things are getting better and better and better. That's history. That's the direction of history, as progressives say. But the only real reason, says Chesterton, for being a progressive is that things naturally tend to grow worse. The corruption in things is not only the best argument for being progressive, it is also the only argument against being conservative. The conservative theory would really be quite sweeping and unanswerable if it were not for this one fact, meaning that things tend to grow worse if we let them alone. But all conservatism is based upon the idea that if you leave things alone, you leave them as they are, but you do not. If you leave a thing alone, you leave it to a torrent of change. If you leave a white post alone, it will soon be a black post. If you particularly want it to be white, you must be always painting it again. That is, you must be always having a revolution. Briefly, if you want the old white post, you must have a new white post. But this, which is true even of inanimate things, is in a quite special and terrible sense true of all human things. An almost unnatural vigilance is really required of the citizen because of the horrible rapidity with which human institutions grow old. It is the custom in passing romance and journalism to talk of men suffering under old tyrannies. But as a fact, men have almost always suffered under new tyrannies, under tyrannies that had been public liberties hardly 20 years before. Chesterton is almost like a prophet. Now, this is what he also says about this question. And this is very funny. We constantly hear a particularly cosmic creed from the modern humanitarians. I use the word humanitarian in the ordinary sense, as meaning one who upholds the claims of all creatures against those of humanity. They suggest that through the ages, we have been growing more and more humane. That is to say that one after another, groups or sections of beings, slaves, children, women, cows, or whatnot, have been gradually admitted to mercy or to justice. They say that we once thought it right to eat man. We didn't. But I am not here concerned with their history, which is highly unhistorical. As a fact, anthropophagy is certainly a decadent thing, not a primitive one. It is much more likely that modern man will eat human flesh out of affectation than that primitive man ever ate it out of ignorance. I am here only following the outlines of their argument, which consists in maintaining that man has been progressively more lenient, first to citizens, then to slaves, then to animals, and then presumably to plants. I think it wrong to sit on a man. Soon, I shall think it wrong to sit on a horse. Eventually, I suppose, I shall think it wrong to sit on a chair. Now, I think this is very powerful stuff. And if we could talk like this today, we could be much, much more successful in our apologetics. Another example of how he tackles this question of progressivism. Now, here comes in the whole collapse and huge blunder of our age. we have mixed up two different things, two opposite things. Progress should mean that we are always changing the world to suit the vision. Progress does mean, just now, that we are always changing the vision. This, therefore, is our first requirement about the ideal towards which progress is directed. It must be fixed. Whistler used to make many rapid studies of a sitter. It did not matter if he tore up 20 portraits, but it would matter if he looked up 20 times and each time saw a new person sitting placidly for his portrait. So it does not matter, comparatively speaking, how often humanity fails to imitate its ideal, for then all its old failures are fruitful. But it does frightfully matter how often humanity changes its ideal, for then all its old failures are fruitless. Now, this is what I call jovial subversiveness. Now, this is another very, very good quotation. An imbecile habit has arisen in modern controversy of saying that such and such a creed can be held in one age, but cannot be held in another. Now, this is exactly what we Christians are accused of. Some dogma, we are told, was credible in the 12th century, but is not credible in the 20th, or we could say the 21st. But Chesterton says, you might as well say that a certain philosophy can be believed on Mondays, but cannot be believed on Tuesdays. You might as well say of a view of the cosmos that it was suitable to 3:30, but not suitable to 4:30. What a man can believe depends upon his philosophy, not upon the clock or the century. If a man believes in unalterable natural law, he cannot believe in any miracle in any age. If a man believes in a will behind law, he can believe in any miracle in any age. So I hope you see these were some examples of how Chesterton does apologetics. I think this is very, very powerful and also funny, and it subverts the mainline thought systems. Paul says in Colossians 4:6, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Before I end and we get to the questions, some caveats. I have to mention that Chesterton used his apologetic methods to defend Roman Catholicism, not just Christianity. At one point in his life, he became Roman Catholic from Anglican, and so I'm not recommending his arguments for Roman Catholicism, but as if I want to defend him, I would say that Chesterton wanted to be fully Orthodox, and that was his rebellion against secular progressivism and the ideas that surrounded him that he thought were against Christianity, against revelation. And I think he had two ways to go from mainline Anglicanism, and one was toward Roman Catholicism, the other would have been to go to evangelical Christianity. And I think he was very attracted to the Middle Ages, the pre-modern era, and probably evangelicalism wasn't visible to him. So he went to Roman Catholicism. So we have to be aware of that. The other caveat is that sometimes he, I think, overplays his hands in using way too many paradoxes. And not all of his paradoxes are revealing. But we can certainly learn an awful lot from Chesterton about what it means to season our speech with salt. And so I really recommend him for you to read him if you haven't. And